reading from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 9 to 15a. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." May God bless the reading and hearing of these words.
Thank you. One of the very early lessons I learned about myself in my life was that I was distracting to others. I learned that very quickly. I learned it very efficiently. I was a distraction in my elementary school classrooms. I talked too much. I talked too loudly. And I had a hard time keeping my hands to myself, so they would often move my desk out into the hallway right in front of the door. And so when my parents came to pick me up and came around the corner, they would usually just see me doing work by myself at my desk in the hallway because that's where they had moved me so I wouldn't bother anyone else. So I learned early that my natural state, my natural inclination and presence in the world was a distraction to other people. So I learned how to be silent, and I learned how to be still. I became comfortable with silence and comfortable in silence. I was socialized to silence and solitude very, very early on. Of course, all of that energy had to go somewhere. So in 4th grade, I chose the drums to play in band so I could make as much noise as possible in controlled situations. But I've seen those same kinds of tendencies in my own children, and I know what happened to me, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but it might have something to do with how comfortable I am with solitude and silence, and I'm trying to nurture that into something healthy. It is a desperation for connection to other people, and that's healthy to start with. Elijah, the prophet, knows that it's time to go listen to God because of the silence that happens. God has a habit of misdirection, of redirection, right? You think God's going to go one way, and God comes out of a completely different direction. God zags. You think God's taking you in a particular direction, and you start heading that way, but then that way is blocked. And you hear God leading you off in another direction. Jesus does this all the time. He takes side trips, he circles around, he goes to and from unexpected places. And this is the story of God's redirection of the prophet Elijah. Elijah, in 1 Kings, has come to believe, come to understand that his path is leading him in one direction. That is the end of his journey as a prophet. That he has nothing left to give as a prophet. But God redirects them in silence. Let's review our Old Testament reading rules real quick. When we read the Hebrew Bible, especially the history books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which really just repeat what's in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, we have to understand that these are hero tales. They are meant to be hero tales. They are exaggerated. They are part history, part mythology. The stories of Samuel and David and Solomon and the prophet Elijah and people like Ruth, these stories are built up, they are embellished to lift up heroic tales from Israel's past. It is vital for us to understand these days that these stories were not originally presented as facts. They were not originally read as factual history. The original readers knew that these were their legends. And there's meaning in that, and there's power in that. The writers knew it, the original readers knew it, the generations that read these tales before the birth of Christ, they all knew that. We also need to understand that, like most fables and myths and legends, the point is the moral of the story. What's the moral of the story? The point is not King David is always a hero, right? Because he's very much not, right? But how can we lift up King David in the history of the Hebrew Bible, also knowing the horrible things he did to Bathsheba? The moral of the story is the point of that passage. Christians get so caught up in finding the calendar and defending the authenticity and the accuracy and the historicity of these texts that we miss the meaning. We miss what the story's saying. The work of reading the Hebrew Bible is finding what is the meaning in this story, not when did this actually happen. And the final step is understanding that these are hyperbolic, exaggerated dramas. This is not VeggieTales. This is Game of Thrones. This is betrayal and backstabbing and politics and scheming and treachery and violence and sex and everything else that goes into a good myth, ancient history story. We know that all of the things that these texts probably happened to some extent, right? But it's probably a much smaller scale, a much more localized scale than we have in our heads when we read them. We're looking for truth, not facts. Okay, so this is not a textbook. We're not reading a history textbook. We're asking ourselves, what's the moral of the story? This lesson, this story, starts with Elijah fleeing for his life. As south can get from where he is and still be in Israel's territory. And he's running from Jezebel. You know that name. You probably know that name and you have no idea where it comes from. 1 Kings, chapter 17, 18, and 19. Jezebel is the Cersei Lannister of 1 Kings, if we're going to keep with the Game of Thrones imagery. So Elijah was an active prophet under the king of King Ahab of Israel. And Ahab marries Jezebel. It happens all the time. Somebody marries a foreign person to form an alliance between those two nation states. Jezebel is not an Israelite. And Jezebel was a princess of a neighboring Arab nation, brings with her a dedication to Baal, a local Canaanite understanding of God. And so into the kingdom of Israel, through Jezebel, Ahab kind of just gives up and basically gives the throne over to Jezebel. And he's not in charge at all anymore, and she's calling all the shots. So in the kingdom of Israel, we have hero Israel. Yahweh is the God, and Yahweh is the only God, but through Jezebel, Ahab brings prophets and priests and practices of Baal religion into the Israelite kingdom. And so Elijah is our hero, the prophet of Yahweh, and his job it was to tell Ahab to knock it off and to bring Yahweh back, to get rid of all of this Baal stuff, or something bad is going to happen. And of course, being a legend and a myth, there is a confrontation. And Elijah says, I can prove it. I'll show you that Yahweh is the Lord. And there are 450 prophets of Baal over here, and there's Elijah by himself over here. And they build an altar out of wood, and they try to light it on, they tell Baal to light it on fire without any oil or fuel or spark or anything. And they can't do it for days. They try. And Elijah, over here by himself, goes and it lights on fire, right? And he proves that Yahweh is, he says, hey God, it's me. And it's like, do you remember, nobody remembers. But one time, Ned Flanders was bowling on The Simpsons, and he got a 9, and they were all excited because they got to win because Ned Flanders didn't get a strike, and Ned Flanders said, God, it's me, and then the other one fell down. That's what Elijah does. Elijah proves that Yahweh is God and the Lord, and the fire starts, which, of course, sends Jezebel off the rails, and Jezebel is coming for Elijah. This is why Elijah is on the run. This is why Elijah comes to this cave and spends the night. This is why God comes to Elijah and says, what are you doing here? Elijah is running from Jezebel. So he runs, and he runs into the wilderness and asks God to end his life. He goes from winning this contest of priests to saying, kill me now. Elijah is freaking out and getting all woe is me, and you remember what God says? God says, Elijah, eat something. Literally. An angel from Yahweh comes to Elijah on the run, and he's saying, God, kill me now. Kill me before Jezebel can. And the angel says, why don't you find something to eat, have a rest, and we'll talk about this some other time. It's literally what they say to Elijah. And so Elijah prays. He answers God, what are you doing here? And God tells him that he's about to come by and to go out to the mountain. And I'll tell you what to do. Very Moses, right? Out on the mountain, I'm about to pass by. Hide your face from me. And then we have this poetry that's poetic in English and Hebrew. There was a great rock-breaking wind, but God was not in the wind. There was an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. There was a fire, and God was not in the fire. And then there was silence, and that's when Elijah went out. That's when Elijah knew that God was speaking. It's really interesting to me that Elijah's prayer doesn't change. Did you hear that? Like, what Elijah said the first time God said, what are you doing here, is exactly the same as what Elijah said the second time. And I just feel like, I imagine Elijah came in a little hot the first time. Like we have to tell our kids to slow down all the time. Like their mouths are going faster than their brains. Or no, other way around. Like I just did. Their brains are going faster than their mouths, and we have to say, stop, take a breath, start over. The prayer is exactly the same. I'm scared for my life. God came to Elijah and says, calm down, take a breath, have a nap and a snack, and then we'll come back to this. Don't confuse your earthquakes for God's messages. Just because something is big and loud and flashy, just because something is doomy and gloomy, doesn't mean it's God's voice. It doesn't make it necessarily important. Just because it's loud. In fact, I've learned that it's usually the opposite. That the bluster and the volume is a distraction from how empty the content actually is. It's kind of like how every time a president of the United States does something wildly unpopular or wildly unsuccessful or exceedingly horrible, Iran is magically a week away from making nuclear weapons. That's been happening my entire life. Benjamin Netanyahu came out in 1994 and said Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuclear arsenal and we have to go to war with them. It's a big, loud, brash distraction that happens to involve the breaking of black and brown bodies, which it typically does. Don't confuse the earthquakes for messages. This world is so loud. Literally and figuratively, this world is so loud. We have invented things. Imagine explaining to someone 200 years ago noise-canceling headphones. What are you talking about? Just go outside. What are you talking about? I said, I have to have a television show on when I'm brushing my teeth, so I'm not in my own head. There are 6 or 7 kids in my house every day on this summertime, and I can't hear a thing. God forbid, do you remember when restaurants used to have ceilings? And now, none of them have ceilings, and God forbid you go to a restaurant that has an open kitchen, because you can't talk to anyone. We are so loud. There's just so much noise in this world. So I saw this thing in 2010. There was an art project called Portraits in the Presence of Marina Abramovich. Artists Marina Abramovich and Marco Anelli. Photography project and an installation at the New York Museum of Modern Art. There was a chair, and Abramovich sat in the chair, and there was a chair facing her. And for days, for a week, anyone who wished could come and sit in the chair opposite her, but you couldn't say a word, and you had to maintain eye contact for as long as you sat there. And Anelli took photos of the people who were looking this artist in the eyes, and it was just uncontrollable giggles, uncontrollable sobbing and tears, that the act of sitting in silence and looking another human being in the eye was the most emotionally honest experience of these people's lives. When they finally shut off the noise and the distractions. It was true emotion, whatever it was, positive or negative. It was true and deep and unfiltered. And I'm starting to think that it is only in silence that we will be able to see the world as it is, see ourselves as we are, and hear the message God has for us. Don't confuse loud with meaningful, flashy with spiritual. Individual lives, neighborhoods, literally, and metaphorically, everything spiritual. It's just so loud, and we can confuse that loudness with message. We can miss the message entirely. Because it's drowned out by all of that noise. Sometimes we're so addicted to the shouting that we're not shouting about the right stuff. We're just shouting because it's what we do. We're not making enough noise about the things that matter. So, Elijah, God comes to Elijah in absolute crisis, in absolute turmoil, tearing his clothes, woe is me, shouting and screaming. And God comes and says, first, he says nothing. And there's silence. And then he says, Elijah, have a snack, take a nap, be quiet for a second. Now, what do you need? That's how God comes to us. Some of you are going to hate this next part. Kirk, talking about you. Bryn. I want to spend the next 2 minutes in silence. Something happens. I could talk for a minute, and that would feel one way to you. You would experience me speaking 60 seconds of words differently than us sitting in silence for 60 seconds. Also, you all talking amongst yourselves would feel very different and faster, right, than me speaking for 60 seconds. But I want to sit in silence. If you're at home, I want you to stop washing the dishes or getting lunch out or whatever you do at home. Let's just